The key to the Hermetic Sanctum, La Clef du Cabinet Hermétique, an enigmatic alchemical text penned by an anonymous French alchemist emerged from the shadows of the 18th century, steeped in the esoteric traditions of Hermetic philosophy. Composed in Middle French and preserved in a rare manuscript, the work surfaced in the personal collection of Albert H. Gallatin, a Swiss-American scholar of chemistry and ancient languages, whose fascination with alchemy lent the text historical weight. Its primary aim is to decode the symbolic wisdom of the Emerald Tablet, offering a foundation for alchemical practice through veiled metaphors and intricate allegories. The manuscript gained prominence due to its influence on Fulcanelli, the mysterious 20th-century alchemist, whose cryptic references to it sparked intrigue among scholars and practitioners. Shrouded in mystery, the text's anonymous authorship, coupled with speculative ties between Gallatin and Fulcanelli, adds to its allure, making it a pivotal yet elusive artifact in the study of alchemy, religion, and the occult. Its first English translation, published in 2021 by Rubedo Press, has further cemented its significance for historians and alchemical enthusiasts alike. We highly recommend acquiring and studying this text, as it has been very well organized and annotated for the student of alchemy. The key to the Hermetic Sanctum. First part, forward. Many people will accuse me of temerity and presumption when they see that I dare undertake here the instruction of very learned men in the chemical arts, teaching them things they have so far ignored by pointing out to them what they have misunderstood. I say that I am far removed from the perfect knowledge of this art, however, to see that I am useful to the public, and if the scholars find some things which are not to their liking, the sincerity with which I write must much less induce their indignation as to serve as an X for them, and either that error has blinded me, like many others, or that a certain work led me to the truth. It is always very certain that many people will have this advantage, that in the future they will withdraw from the unnecessary expenses which they make by unsuccessful work, and of the loss of time which must be so precious to them, and so dear in relation to their salvation, and which must be the principal occupation of the Christians, to first seek the kingdom of God, and all will succeed you. Thus said the Lord, in the Gospel, Q's. The method that I have proposed in order to do such an excellent work is quite different from what others have followed in this path, which is so slippery and leads so many people to the precipice. I have as guarantor the great men who have written on this science, and above all the famous Hermes, however. He has written us few things, having left very few of his writings. But in this little speech he nevertheless teaches us the whole secret of this great work, and it may be said that this, i.e., the present treatise, is only an explanation or commentary on his Emerald Tablet, in which is contained all the mysteries of this admirable art. This is why I entitled it The Key to the Hermetic Sanctum. This treatise also teaches you a way of understanding the philosophers who have hidden this divine art under parables and signs, and under such different names as to hide it from the ignorant and the unworthy. First chapter. That there are few people who have understood how the stone of the philosophers is made, and will never understand it if God, by a singular grace, does not reveal it to them or some philosophers. For who could imagine that what men seek so eagerly for so long is nevertheless enclosed in a matter which they trample underfoot, and which they throw through the streets, which they always have before their eyes, which is found in the garbage and in the manure? Eyes, this is what must confound the pride of men who despise things which they should esteem, and who honour and respect what is nothing in its origin. The gold which shines in there dazzles them. They make of it their idol, which often costs them great concern and great anxiety to acquire it, even at the very cost of their eternal salvation, if they knew the matter of which it is made. They might not have such a high opinion, and would be obliged to admit that the figure and all the brilliance of this world passes away, and that it is nothing compared to the sentiment of the Prophet King, all flesh is only manure. The Scripture puts glass in comparison with gold, even though it is only made of ash. Remember, man, you are only ashes. The philosophers have therefore been right to hide this mystery from the eyes of those who value things only by the usages which they have given them. For, if they knew or were openly discovering the matter which God took pleasure in hiding in things that seem useful to them, they would have no more esteem. The matter is unique in its principle, nature acting only by the same principles. It is only different in species and form. For example, the food that man takes changes itself and converts it into the substance of man. The same food which serves as nourishment for man can be changed into the substance of the animal and into a substance much more noble than the matter from which he nourishes himself. It is the same in the stone of the philosophers. Though the matter is vile, it is changed by art into a perfection much more noble than the subject from which it draws the matter. The philosophers have used two ways to achieve this great secret. The first regards art, and nature has little part in it. In the second, it is nature that makes it, and art only helps. The former is difficult and expensive, and the latter is easy and of little expense. It is the latter of which I treat, and which almost all the ancients have followed. Most of those who have written have followed this latter path. Among them are Artephius, Zacher, Trevisan, Flamel, and many others. The first was unknown to them, or at least if they knew it, they published the last under the name of the first, which is very difficult to develop in the reading of the philosophers, who are often putting these two ways together to confuse the readers. Philalethes, who has written of the last, warns us not to accept the exchange. These ways, though different in their operation, considering the subject which they used, the matter is always unique and the same. The science of alchemy has found other ways even more different, for the philosophers have invented other means more abridged than nature was able to for the perfection and transmutation of metals. The Cosmopolitan points some out to us. He says that there are some who know how to change iron into copper, that from Jupiter they make mercury, that from Saturn they have made silver. And he says that if they knew how to join to these transmutations the nature of the sun, they would make something more precious than gold itself. There are trees, though wild, upon which one can attach grafts of solar and lunar trees, and by this means improvements and transmutations can be made, which trees bear fruits, conforming to the solar and lunar species. That is to say, imperfect metals, after having reduced them to their first principles, and having purified them, the vegetative soul may be joined to it by a single path known only to true philosophers, and not by that path which the vulgar philosophers imagine, and which is often abused by many people who do not know their ignorance. Our matter is enclosed in impure bodies. We must corrupt these bodies, not by a leprous corruption which destroys everything, but by a corruption which proceeds to generation from death to life, and which by a glorious resurrection gives birth to this son of the sun, which must be given to his father, and made to return to his mother's womb, that is to say, to join him to this fixed and permanent body, so that the living will resurrect the dead, and these two bodies, animated by the same spirit, will produce children similar to their father and mother. That is all that can be said of matter in general. It a humidity, called unctuous, which contained in all the beings of nature, a viscous and gummy matter it hides, deeply in the centre of the elements, which unites them so closely that it is impossible to separate them without a single means known to the philosophers. It covers itself with the mantle of the elements, and they have no power over it, not even fire, however violent it may be, the matter being fixed and unalterable in its nature. This is why the philosophers say that it is permanent in the fire. It is the proximate matter of their stone, which is what made Basil Valentine say these admirable words. "Search," he said, "in the bowels of the earth, you will find there our hidden stone and true medicine. It is the first matter of metals, which are more or less perfect according to whether it is joined to matters more or less perfect. If it is joined to a pure matter, it forms gold. If it is less pure, it forms silver. If it is even more impure, it forms lead. Similarly, the others. It is the dry humidity of Geber which does not wet the hands. Now this matter, although very fixed in its nature, easily volatilizes by means of the elements which serve it as a vehicle, develops and joins itself to them without nevertheless altering its nature in the manner of fire, which is mingled in all beings, and which is always fire, when it is reduced from potency into action, as well as the sun which spreads its influences all over the earth, and which is always sun. This is why it is susceptible to the impressions of the elements and the influences of the stars which it attracts and retains. It is the steel of the sages. Magnet. It ascends from earth to heaven and descends from heaven to earth and fills itself with the influences of heaven, primarily of the great luminary, and it serves the multiplication and generation of all the stars. It is by its means that they receive their actions and their movement. Animals receive life by it, and all that which is animated in nature, man himself cannot do without it. It maintains his life and his movement. It performs the function of a female in nature by receiving the action and the movement from heaven and from the stars, and principally from the sun, which is the male. It is like the womb that receives the male seed. It performs the sperm, marriage between heaven and earth. It is that which contains the hidden fire of the sages, without which the artist cannot reach the end, which we will deal with in a specific chapter. The matter of the. From these two sperms is formed Mercury of the philosophers. That is why the great Hermes said these admirable words to us. The sun is the father, and the moon the mother. The air carries it in its belly, which is the womb and the receptacle. The Cosmopolitan says that it is found in the belly of Aries, signifying by Aries the beginning of spring, when the sun enters into that celestial sign which is the renewal of that spirit which animates all nature at that time. It is this seed, thrown into the sea of the sages, which is our air, which gives all the fertility to our stone. It is this seed which they know how to extract by means unknown to the vulgar chymists, and which they know how to join with a pure sulphur. They call this seed argent vive, quicksilver. That is why they say that their stone is composed of argent vive and pure sulphur. They give to the first the name of the moon, and to the second that of the sun. These are the two luminaries that you must extract from the stone. Great. The commerce of heaven and earth is perfectly well described in the Cosmopolitan by a comparison. He points out to you what the philosopher must do, who is to be the imitator of nature that God so formed, having joined heaven with earth, which has its stars, which are the sun and the moon, and our master tells us that all that which is above is like all that which is below. Similarly, the philosopher must join heaven with the earth. He must draw from the chaos, that is to say from his subject, the luminaries, to separate the light from the darkness, and by the union of the spirit to make a perfect whole, imitating by this act God in the creation of the world. It is according to this last perspective that our art is called a divine art. Having drawn out these luminaries and these elements, after having stripped them of their filth and their earthliness, they make of it a homogeneous whole, a compound which they call elixir, which contains the power of heaven and earth, which Hermes calls the power of powers, which reduces everything from potency into action, and all this potency is reduced into a small amount of powder. That is why it is not surprising if it has such great effects, both for health and for the perfection of imperfect metals. For this divine powder has the virtue of purifying the elements of man and brings them to their natural equilibrium, whose disturbance is the proximate cause of destruction. We shall deal with its virtues, which are innumerable, in a special chapter. It has no less effect on metals. Of the imperfect, it makes them perfect. The purpose of nature is to make them perfect and to turn them into gold. But having been prevented in its operation, and being unable to reach its end, it makes imperfect metals, not gold, and that which nature achieves in a great number of years, the philosopher does in a few hours. Thus there is nothing more worthy of the occupation of man than to work on this divine work, or to search, since he can acquire health and wealth. By this science, which must be preferred to all other sciences except for that of the salvation of his soul, which must be his principal occupation. Seek first, says the Lord in his Gospel, the kingdom of heaven, and all things will be given to you as well. It may also be said that this science is divine, because it is only God who gives it, and who taught it to Moses, to his sibling Aaron, to the patriarchs, and to their descendants, to Solomon, who had a perfect knowledge of it, and which was preserved until the time of Ezra, who rebuilt the temple after the captivity of Babylon. Shem, one of the sons of Noah, had it depicted on the pillars that were found after the deluge. Shem had learned it from Adam. It was by its means that they lived so long. It was preserved and communicated Kabbalistically to some of the Jews. Therefore, only God or a friend God has inspired can communicate it to you. If you have this privilege, preserve it as a precious treasure, but above all, do not communicate it to the unworthy. For you will draw upon yourself the curse of God, who will punish you with no less than a sudden death, or put you in the hands of powers that would make you perish in a prison. As for the possession of the stone of the philosophers, it is not as difficult as most imagine it. It is nature which acts, and it certainly always acts by certain principles, unless it finds certain obstacles in its way. But if you know how to remove these obstacles, it will infallibly come to its end, and to the conclusion that God has commanded. It is true that, as to the particular matter, it is impossible for man to determine it. God by his power has determined all the beings of nature to make such a form. Thus man cannot create anything, and Solomon says that there is nothing new under heaven. God has imposed this law on all nature, to make and multiply each according to his species by his grand word, fiat. This law is enclosed in every seed that inviolably follows it, and every being obeys this law, as we say every day in our Pater fiat voluntas tua sicut in caelo et in terra. The philosopher does not pretend to do anything by himself, and cannot determine any being to make such a species, for it would be a kind of creation that is reserved for the sovereign creator of the universe. But he makes use of the general matter which he moves from potency to actuality, which he knows how to extract from imperfect things by separating it from imperfect matters, from the filth and impurities which render it incapable of acting, in order that, from its former imperfection, it is rendered more than perfect, and of a perfection capable of perfecting everything according to its species. In plants, for example, it makes them grow in less time, they give their fruits in greater abundance. In minerals it transmutes metals into gold, stronger in colour than common gold. In man it purifies his humours, puts them in a perfect equilibrium. It maintains and preserves that celestial fire which makes his life, his movement, and his action. It communicates this incombustible oil and this radical humour to the not difficult to heart where life and movement reside. So it is understand that it provides a long life. As for the subject, I will tell you as philosophers that it is everywhere, since nature itself is the subject and the general matter. But they have, however, one subject in particular which contains all that is necessary to achieve this great work. For whoever would work indiscriminately on all the subjects of nature, life would not be long enough to achieve it. Every mixture demands different works. Some are too far removed from the matter of which they compose their stone, and from the particular matter which is the proximate matter, and their fire, without which they can do nothing, would be even more difficult to find. The mixtures and the weights of nature are unknown to them, and due to the long labours which they would be obliged to perform, and the expenses, he, the alchemist, would be forced to abandon the work. For what concerns our subject, the expense is moderate, and the Hermetic Triumpho says that it does not exceed the sum of 10 souls to have the subject matter to do the work. This subject appears in a very vile form, which renders it despicable to the eyes of men. Though it contains a precious treasure, it is covered with some rags. But under these rags you will soon see with your own eyes the shining gold, the celestial colour of the rainbow, signs that will make you know what it contains and what it is capable of. You will see there in the second operation the light come out of the darkness and its chaos. You will see there the 2 luminaries that will appear dry to you, and Saturn adorned with a black robe, the black dragon. In a few days you will see the spirit become a body. You will see Diana. You will see the 2 mountains from which flows the precious stream which emerges from the stone brighter than crystal, and finally the first elements from which the philosophers form their mercury and their argent vive. You will see all these operations without putting your hands on them. It is this subject that the Father hides from his Son, and the Son from his Father. It is only God and a friend who can reveal it. Third chapter, of the preparation of the elements and their separation in general. I will tell you first, in general, that the preparation of our elements is not properly a separation, but rather a depuration of the spiritual principles which compose our stone, which nature has more of a part of than the artist. Do the philosophers not tell you that their stone sublimes, dissolves, grows, coagulates, and fixes itself? Do we not see in animals and in men that, in regards to the food which descends into the stomach, there is no separation of substance, and everything is reduced into a homogeneous substance, and into a form which we call chyle, with the exception of a few excrements which separate from it? The same thing happens in our stone. We do not separate anything from the substances and principles of the stone, and what appears imperfect, gross, and unclean, we change it into a more subtle matter, more perfect, and more capable of being able to receive the spiritual principles, which is done by means of our fire, which we know to introduce into our matter. It is this fire which is not drawn from the matter, as Pontanus says, which changes all that is gross, imperfect, and unclean into being, and into a purer, more subtle, and more perfect substance. It is true that in this depuration a few feces are separated, which are excrements accidental to the matter, and which are not part of its nature. Thus it is not called a true separation, the principles remaining always united and conjoined. The dregs which separate from the wine are not part of the wine, although it comes out of the matter that makes up the wine. During the growth of metals, we see no perceptible separation, so nature becomes subtilized, transforms itself into other, more perfect forms, clears by degrees, purifies itself more and more by the action of its internal fire, until it has come to its end of perfection. We do the same thing in our work. It is nevertheless true that we separate a few substances principally in the first and second works, but this separation of substance is not a true separation of principles, as the vulgar chymists imagine, who do not understand the meaning of philosophers. For every substance which they separate contains the others. The water which is distilled from a plant contains all the virtue of the plant, and although what remains at the bottom of the vessel is separated from the distilled water and appears under another form, it contains the same virtues and principles of distilled water. When the philosophers speak of the separation of the elements, it is not an essential separation of principles, but a separation of the substances that they call by a name of an element, or the most subtle and free first substances of matter, and which they call air and fire, and the coarsest, earth and water, compared to the nature of the elements, which means properly separating the subtle from the dense, as Hermes says. It is therefore falsely that many imagine that by the terms of elements we mean the common elements, for it would be a kind of creation, if man by the mixture that he would make could form some things. God created everything in number, in weight, and in measure. Thus the philosopher adds nothing to the perfection of what God has done. There is nothing to form and nothing to create. In the first work, it is true that some substances are separated to reunite them after its disengagement, but with regard to the principles and the luminaries, they separate from themselves. It is nature that does this, without the artist applying his hand to it, to make of it a compound that is a mixture, an assemblage, or rather a union of these same principles under one form, under which form are contained two spiritual substances which they call by the name of air and fire, which are invisible, and two corporeal ones that are water and earth that are visible, and they call this compound stone. In the second work, or in the second depuration, it is the artist who makes this separation, and it is in this work, where everything they say of the operations must be applied, and all the terms of distillation, sublimation, coagulation, and the like terms which they use, which mark nothing but a more perfect sublimation more free from matter, which is not done differently than what is done in ordinary chemistry, which teaches us that in order to purify a matter, salt, sulphur, and mercury must be extracted from it, and the feces separate. Ed and the three principles joined together to make it into a liquor and a more perfect substance. We do the same thing in the second work, which are always the same principles and the same substances. These united substances appear in the form of a water, which they call argent vive, and the earth they call it sulphur. Thus they say that their stone is composed of sulphur and argent vive. Others give to the water the name of the moon, and to the earth the name of sulphur, and under several other terms, which we shall explain in a particular chapter. But we must not attach ourselves to the diversity of names. The Cosmopolitan says that the composition of this water is very hidden. The philosophers scarcely ever speak of it, and if they do speak of it, it is only to describe the power and the virtues. That is why he says again that it is rare, since it makes the entire compound of the work. We will speak more particularly about it in its place. They say that this water takes its origin from the air, according to what the great Hermes says, that the air carries it in its belly, and also the author of the Ladder of the Sages. 12. There appear to be only two texts that this might refer to. One is the medieval Latin text called Scala Philosophorum, the Ladder of the Philosophers. The other is the 17th century text entitled Escalier des Sages, Groningen, 1686. From the closer matching title, one would think that this second text is the one our anonymous author is referring to, but there does not seem to be any such statement about our philosophical child being born in the air in this text. But in the Scala Philosophorum there is the following statement, which might be what he had in mind. Therefore, it should be noted that water conserves the fetus in the mother's womb for 3 months. Air also nurtures it for 3 months, and fire guards it for the same amount of time, which, on completion, the blood that nourishes in the womb is cut off and goes to the breasts, and there takes the whiteness of snow. Yet the child would never leave until it takes up a breath of air, then goes out and opens its mouth and is suckled. Egit orciendum quod tribus mensi, our philosophical child, he says, is born in the air. That is why our water has the strength to give life to the earth. It is to put the soul back into its body, which is done at the end of the first work, but this is done in the second, which they confuse with the first. Other philosophers say that it must be taken at the time of its birth, that is to say, in the place of its birth. This air is that which we seek, of which we compose our water and our fire. It is not the air and fire that we feel and breathe. Peace it is in this water that we introduce this fire, we make between the enemies. We make water and fire become friends. This is what the same author quoted to the third degree. It is, he says, that our water is the key to the work. It contains the spirit and soul of the stone. The earth, or the body, or the sulphur, is our bronze, and our bronze is our gold. But all sulphur is not our bronze, nor is the vulgar gold our gold, although they are uterine brothers, coming from the same mother and the same father. 4th chapter, of the elements in particular and their preparation. As for the matter from which we extract our elements, I have already told you that it was found everywhere, but that the philosophers had a particular subject from which they drew them. You will find them unfailingly and more proximally in the metals, and many philosophers have found them there and have done the work, but the method is more difficult because we must open the barriers by a means known to few people. We shall write this work in another treatise on the semi-minerals and plants. It is almost impossible, the matter being too remote, and it would always be necessary to reduce it and join it to the metallic nature, which would be too long a work. Having found the subject freed from the matter which surrounds them and which hides it from the sight of men, take them at the time of their birth, that is to say, at the place of their birth, and if, as Virgil says, the gods are favourable when you have discovered one, the other will soon to you appear. Seek them in the sun and in the moon, where they are alive. Look for them in the air which contains them, and when you find them. That is to say, by meditation, as the great Hermes says, make them appear to the eyes, give them clothes according to their nature. Put them in the womb, for if you put them back into the impure matters, you will corrupt them, and will only produce useless and pernicious abortions. We must therefore strip them of the impure bodies with which they are surrounded, and it is to help you in this practice that we are willing to give you the means to do so, reserving nevertheless what is not permitted to be said, let alone write. However, I will speak to you more clearly than any philosopher has done, provided you have knowledge of this work and that you know the subject of it. You will find the rest, and share it with some friends who know themselves capable of working on this opus. That is why I explain more clearly what I could say more obscurely if I were to write for the public, especially when it comes to getting into the practice. I could use metaphors, hieroglyphics, enigmatic figures, parables, similitudes, comparisons, supposition, and others that I could have invented, as my brothers the philosophers did, under which veils they have hidden the mysteries of this great work of nature from the eyes of the unworthy, and that those of the true philosophers perceive very well through these veils. That is why they say that it is necessary to have the eyes of the lynx to see through, that we must draw the curtain back, that we must not stop at the letter, but in the meaning of the thing, not at the sound of words, but what they signify. It is the same with the knowledge of the principles. We must not attach ourselves to their exterior, we must penetrate into the interior, we must strip them of their rags, we must separate the bark, to give them royal garments, that is to say, to make them as white as the moon and as resplendent as the sun, to remove all darkness from them, to bring the light out from the darkness in order to reconcile what is more opposed, to join the humid with the dry, the fire with the water, the hot with the cold, to draw the air from the water and water from the air, to make the earth water and water earth again, to make earth air and air earth, the fixed volatile and the volatile fixed, to dissolve and to coagulate. All these things appear as paradoxes and antitheses to those who have no knowledge of them, words, which are nonetheless very true, as you will be persuaded after reading this treatise, which I explain in particular in this chapter. I would avoid all those terms under which the philosophers have hidden this admirable work, having written it to serve as a memorial and an agenda for my application, when God by his mercy has given me the opportunity to instruct he to whom I will leave this writing by testament. It is the only good I possess, having not hitherto had the means to work on it and to apply myself entirely to it, for this work requires an entire application. The lawsuits, the domestic affairs, have always prevented me, because with regards to the expenditure, it is very modest, and this must not stop. The application that one may have, it is a natural labour of man, which does not expend his strength. It is not contrary to salvation, because its main purpose is to relieve the poor, to deliver them from their miseries, of their sickness, and to glorify God by founding religious houses and hospitals, by building temples to the honour of God, to establish sacrifices and prayers for the relief of his soul. It is useful to the state, to the country by giving means to the powers to raise armies for the defence of the state. It is therefore a great evil to persecute those who apply themselves to this art, and those who have no office in the Republic, who are neither merchants nor artisans, who are reasonably well off, should apply themselves to it, rather than lead a soft and idle life, amusing themselves with trivialities and things unworthy of a good man's attention. 5th chapter. There are 12 operations, which are as many as the keys to open the gates of our Hermetic Sanctum and of our philosophical subject. These operations are calcination, trituration, dissolution, sublimation, inhumation, ablution, conjunction, fixation, and nutrition. Calcination, for our work, is not a violent operation that is done by the violence of fire, as the vulgar chymists believe. It is properly a drying out of the matter which we wish to strip of its phlegmatic humidity, which is done by mediocre fire. There is a physical calcination of nature, where the artist does not use his hands, the matter calcines itself, which occurs in the middle and at the end of the work. In the middle, when the blackness begins to appear, the sun disappears, and the body of the sun goes behind the moon. Philosophers hear me well, or in its life, when coagulation and fixation begins to occur. Under calcination is understood the rubification, which is a kind of sublimation of the white body of the moon, which by this operation, by increasing the fire by 1 degree, becomes red. Trituration is an operation that almost always precedes calcination. We must crush our matter. When I speak here of our matter in the operations, we must always understand the body of the stone, or the subject of which the body is formed. It can be said for the operations. To grind our matter is not to crush it in a mortar, that is to say, to reduce the matter into small parts. Nature does it in the work without the hands of the artist. It is when the earth begins to sublime and mingle with the other elements. This is still done in the dissolution of the philosophical matter, when it is melted in water and divided in the manner of ice melting in hot water, or rather like a piece of quicklime thrown into water which grinds itself and divides itself almost into atoms. This is the third preparation that we are giving to our subject. Dissolution is the same as is commonly understood, which is the reduction of a body into water, except that it is done somewhat differently in our magisterium, and in our work it is not done all at once, but by repeated lotion. All the matter is reduced into water with the exception of a few feces and residues when the said solvent is sufficiently filled with the terrestrial parts. It is in this operation that the igneous parts mingle with the water, that the fire becomes water and joins with the air, that the air becomes water, that they properly call a conversion of the elements, which is a mixture of the igneous, aqueous, aerial, and terrestrial parts, which always retain their natures of air, fire, water, and earth, which occupy one of the largest spaces between them, by the interposition of water and air, which make them extend and form a larger volume. It is this conversion which makes the commerce between heaven and earth in the macrocosm as in our divine work. The hand of the artist is necessary in this operation. Nature makes this dissolution. When the earth changes into water, it is in this operation, say the philosophers, that the stone dissolves itself. It is this operation, properly, which is the key that opens the 7 gates of our Hermetic Sanctum. For at each dissolution a gate opens. This open gate gives entry into the second, from the second into the third, and so on up to the 7th gate, which gives you the 2 luminaries which are the beginning, as we say below, and this is done through repeated dissolutions. But this dissolution does not take place without having been preceded by the calcination. This operation is the most essential part of the work, for, as Bernard says, everything depends on dissolving and coagulating, for the calcination of the philosophers is properly a coagulation. This is what Philaletes says. In order to unite our natures, we need a homogeneous water to which we prepare the way through the calcination which has preceded and which has previously become a desiccation. This dissolution, he says, is properly only a reduction into atoms of the water with the earth by the sieve of nature, which is the air, and the atoms are more penetrating and more subtle. Sublimation is an operation by which we purify our subject more and more by disengaging the elements from their terrestrial bodies and their maternal impurities, by making the terrestrial parts rise to the upper part of the vessel by the action of our fire, aided by the fire of nature, and by this means the earth receives the virtue of the superior elements. This is what we call sublimation, because the earth acquires a more powerful and sublime virtue. This is also called giving wings to the earth and making the fixed volatile. Philalethes admirably describes this sublimation to us, because, he says, in the sublimation that results, the body then communicates its fixity to the water, and the water shares its volatility to the body. But not all the water rises, and a part of it remains with the body in the bottom of the vessel. If you consider this operation often and carefully, you will notice that the body boils and is sieved in the water, which remains below, and that by means of this same water which pierces and opens the rest of the body, and by this circulation, the water, becoming more subtle, finally draws the soul of the sun gently and without violence. Now, this sublimation is quite contrary to that of the chymists, who, by the violence of fire, render a matter subtle by making it rise in aludols. Our aludols and vessels are the elements. That is why we do not need so many vessels and so many alembics. We talk about them further in a specific chapter. This is what we mean by sublimation. Distillation is often confused with the term sublimation, because the body or the earth, in its sublimation, is distilled by passing through the filter of nature, which is air, and air coagulates, forms drops, and these drops are reduced to water, which arrive in our distillation. The air is the head of the alembic of nature, the receiver is the water, and the cucurbit is the earth. So, you see that we do not need so many alembics and so many vessels. We still need a kind of alembic to separate the spirit from the water and to deflame it, which is the white spirit, and to draw the solar spirit from our bodies, which are our first two luminaries and the white mercury and the citrine mercury that we set apart, and of which we talk about in the practice and in the particular operations. Inhumation is a very essential operation in the work. It is to restore to the earth its humidity, to make the spiritual corporeal, to render the volatile fixed and of a fixity, all the more perfect when this operation is frequently repeated. It is that which is done by repeated imbibition, by moistening the earth until it has drunk all its water. It is again by this operation that the black is whitened, and that the head of the raven is cut off. It is also through this operation that the earth is sublimed and wings are given, aided by sublimation and distillation. Because the operations are performed by each other, they have a very great connection. This is why the philosophers are right in saying that all these operations succeed one another, and are nevertheless performed by the same operation and in the same vessel. This, your due operation, is done mainly in the end of the work, and Philalethes speaks of it in these terms. Cook the matter continually with a fire of its own, so that in vessel I will see arise, and a kind of fog which will incessantly fall drop by drop, day and night. By this circulation the mercury raises every salt, as it is in its first nature, and the body remains below at the bottom of the vessel, still completely in its first nature, until, after quite a long time, the body begins to retain some of the water. Thus the body and the water are each made of each other, participating in the degrees of quality which they each have separately. That is to say, the body communicates its fixity to the water, and the water imparts its volatility to the body. Then he adds, through the medium of the soul, the spirit is thus reconciled with the body, and they both unite in the colour black. Ablution, washing, is an operation by which we whiten the black body of gold by repeated imbibition of its water from which it was drawn. As we whiten this black, we call it washing or lotion. This is why some philosophers have said that their work was a woman's work, because they whiten. It is used only when the stone is black in the first and second works, for in the third the whitening is done differently. One must not confuse what the authors say who only divide the stone into 2 works. We make it much more clear. Consult the chapter where we deal with this. A conjunction is a union of 2 substances which we mix together. The substances are the white mercury and the red mercury, which we join together to make the animated mercury, and the citrine mercury of the first preparation, from which we draw our 2 luminaries, the sun and the moon, which by uniting, by themselves without the artist's hand, pair under a white body which is the white gold of Philalethes, and the moon of the philosophers that some of them write about when they say that when the female mounts the male, these 2 putrefying bodies change into a black body, for when the eclipse of the sun is made by philosophers similar to that of the sun of the macrocosm, which happens by the interposition of the moon upon the sun, the same happens in our philosophical microcosm. We perform this operation again when we join the moon to the body of the sun, when it is necessary to cut the head off the raven and whiten the black body of gold. It is the first marriage and the first conjunction of the male and the female in the last work of the first part. This conjunction is made even more perfectly, but nature does it without the help of the artist. Concerning putrefaction, we do not mean in this operation a leprous putrefaction which destroys everything, but only a putrefaction which proceeds to generation, and it is rather a mortification of the lunar and solar substances, from which mortification we form our luminaries after a due digestion by a suitable fire. The luminaries begin to emerge from their chaos and their eclipse. The body of the sun begins to coagulate into black atoms on the surface of the water. This is what Philalethes understands by the little ravens coming out of their nests, and it is necessary to be very careful that they do not re-enter, taking care to gather them subtly. It is in this sense that the philosophers say to take our luminaries during their births. And it is then, says Philalethes, that it is necessary to govern the fire well, and not push it in such a way that you exhaust the water, and that the earth that has collapsed has none at all. And it is necessary to prevent the young ravens from returning to their nests once they have departed, for they are the tiny black atoms which appear on the surface of the water. It is also necessary to do this, so that, due to lack of heat, the earth will be suffocated and drowned by excess water. Coagulation, fixation, and nutrition are particularly relevant to the second part of the work, which is the multiplication that we deal with in another chapter. Second part, of the operations in particular, which are absolutely necessary for the practice. We have said in the preceding chapters all that was necessary for the knowledge of the principles of the stone and the theory. Now we shall enter into the practice. It is this black forest of which Philalethes and Polyphilus speak, which must be penetrated, and where so many people go astray without a good guide who shows them a straight path, and gives them the means to find their way out. This maze and labyrinth has 7 gates, defined by the gates from which one cannot leave without the thread of Ariadne. In this stormy sea there are so many reefs where so many people are shipwrecked unless they have an expert steersman. Finally, the philosophers have hidden this practice further in their writings, which they have mingled with so many figures, enigmas, metaphors, similitudes, suppositions, contrarieties, and even expressions that are impossible to understand without the help of a good artist or a good master. Because when they seem to speak most clearly, it is when they are less sincere, and when they speak most obscurely, then they are telling you the truth. They have used them in this way, as I have already told you and pointed out, to hide our knowledge from the ignorant and from the people incapable of possessing it, leaving it to the order of divine providence to inspire who he pleases. Some have followed a different method. They have not assumed or imagined anything, but they have mingled the operations in such a way that one can easily confuse one operation with another, such that what is appropriate to one is not appropriate to the other. They describe at the beginning what must be at the end, and often put the end at the beginning. This causes confusion in the mind when reading their writings, which is not insignificant. It is Philalethes who, of all the philosophers, has followed this style of writing the most, where he so adroitly mingled these distinct operations, and sews them so well together that it seems that he speaks of the same operation, but we know how to rupture the fabric. However, it is this philosopher who speaks most sincerely. He has the good faith to warn the reader not to accept the exchange. It is this philosopher who has entered into the practice more than any other, and who was last to have written. That is why I quote him often, and more than the others, but he is particularly attached to writing about the mineral stone, which he calls difficult, whose material is gold and vulgar mercury. For that which is the way of the ancients, and which is the easiest, is made without mercury or vulgar gold, and is that of the ancients. He does not speak much about it, but he nevertheless mixes up several mineral operations with the stone of the moderns, which belongs to that of the ancients. When I speak about the philosophers, I mean to speak about the genuine ones. There are many who pass for philosophers, but who never were, and who have never known the stone. Even though they have written to appear knowledgeable in this art, one must guard against them, because they can make you abandon the right path. It is even more necessary to avoid reading certain manuscripts, which they call procedures, where they write everything point by point. This is what you will never see in a genuine philosopher. But these kinds of authors risk nothing. Only those who work with them or according to their method lose their time and money. It is specifically to draw you away from this faulty step that I prepared this treatise, so that you can distinguish the false brethren from the genuine, so that, upon finding and knowing a genuine adept, he can lead you and teach you what you can scarcely do on your own in the practice, and so for this reason you must associate with him. It is therefore to assist you on this thorny path, and to resolve all the difficulties which might prevent you from reaching the desired end, that I have prepared this writing. I will not tell you things point by point, so that you have nothing left to discover. That was not allowed me. I must leave you some things to do. It is not right that you should obtain this great secret of nature, which requires so much effort and even expense, without some trouble and labour. I do not use any supposition nor similitude, but only a few figurative expressions. Finally, I tell you the pure truth, which I only hide behind a light veil, which is clear enough to penetrate through. Therefore, to give some order to a matter which the philosophers have affected to write without order, I divide the stone, or our work, which is also commonly called the magisterium, into two parts, which the authors call the first and second works. The first looks at the whole composition of the stone and its perfection until the fermentation. The second includes all the operations that are necessary for the final perfection of the stone. I divide it differently for greater clarification of the first part. This first part I will divide into 3 different orders, following the division of Geber, that great king of the Arabs who wrote very learnedly. I call the first, like him, the medicine, or the work of the first order. I say everything that belongs to this order and to this work, so as not to confuse what belongs to the first, and not to give it to the second and the third, which, on the contrary, I divide into as many chapters, which is not of a small consequence for the intelligence of the writings of the philosophers and for the practice of our divine work. First chapter, of the extraction of the tinctures. After having drawn our matter from its mine, you must cleanse it well in order to remove its impurities, and after having cleansed it, you let the sediment fall and settle at the bottom of the water. Desiccate and calcine it, and when it is well calcined, pulverized, and crushed into small pieces, set it aside. It is necessary that you have a good quantity, because it contains a lot of matter but little spirit. For it is from this one and only matter that we draw out all that is necessary for the work in a linear way. A certain philosopher describes this operation perfectly by these terms. He says that after the flow of waters from the universal deluge, the ark found itself on the mountain of Armenia, climb, he said, on this mountain you will find a loamy soil from which flows a stream of admirable virtue. And he adds, if you do not understand me, you are not philosophers, and you will never be one. This philosopher has reason to speak thus, because in this operation here it must be preceded by a deluge of water, after which the ark rests upon the mountain, which is our matter and our subject. It is necessary to penetrate and pass through this mountain in order to bring out this stream and a water of incomparable virtue. It is from this water that our luminaries come out, as you will see below. It was after the deluge of water that the ark rested on this mountain of Armenia. Likewise, it is after the frequent and repeated ablutions of our earth that we extract from it the lard and all the unctuosity, which is the proximate matter of the stone, from which we strike the stone, and the rock by Aaron's rod, to bring out this living water proper for the health of spirits and bodies, and even though it is still impure, its simple use cured several diseases, as has been experienced. And if you let the water that covered this mountain flow clear, you will see with your own eyes the ark of the Lord, i.e., the sun, and gold, in its first being, will shine visibly before your eyes. And the sign of peace, i.e., the rainbow, will shine with all its colours. But to make these lotions and ablutions, do not think that it is with the common water of the fountains and rivers. The water we use has many other virtues. It is a water that contains all the virtues of heaven and earth. That is why it is the general solvent of all nature. She opens the barriers, and it is she who opens all the gates of our Hermetic and royal Sanctum, where our king and queen are enclosed. So she is their bath, where they wash themselves. It is the fountain of Trevisan, where the king divests himself of his purple cloak. The key to the Hermetic Sanctum, third Saturn, that to put on a black garment that he gives to expression of this philosopher is admirable. He describes it to us via the birth of the raven, whose colour is so necessary in the work and so desirable. It is true that this water is difficult to obtain. This is what made the cosmopolitan say in his enigma that it was rare on the island, but by this figure he tells you the time to gather it. He says that the meadows of this island were dotted with 1,000 flowers, and that in these meadows graze sheep and oxen, guarded by 2 young shepherds. He wants to point out to us by this enigma that it is necessary to collect this water in the spring, when the sun traverses the 3 celestial signs. Aries, Taurus. Gemini, the sheep marks the sign of Aries, the oxen the sign of Taurus, and the 2 shepherds the sign of the twins, who are depicted as 2 young children. These dotted meadows of 1,000 flowers mark the quality of this water, which contains innumerable virtues. This author signifies it for us even more particularly by these words. It is not like the water that comes out of the clouds, but it has all the appearance of it. In another place, he describes it to us under the name of steel and magnet. For it is truly a magnet which attracts to itself all the influences of the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars, in order to communicate them to the earth. He says that this steel is found in Aries, which still marks the beginning of spring, when the sun traverses the sign of Aries. You can only have this water by means of our earth, which attracts it in the same way that the water of the tree or of the plant is attracted by its roots. That is why they need frequent watering. In the same way, we can only have this water by frequent and repeated watering, through which the earth is completely filled with water, which it obtains via lotion. We wash it several times, and in this lotion it gives every virtue to the water, not the first time, but on the 7th, because we said that our sanctum had 7 figurative gates, and via these 7 lotions. For the king and the queen come out only by this means, of the separation of the elements. I see impossible to make a true separation of the elements in our work without it first being preceded by putrefaction. It is by means of this operation that nature is stripped of all its impurities, because there is in our principles says Philalethes, much superfluity of a different nature, which can never be rendered pure enough. Arnaldus says, chapter 6, that our stone is divided into 4 elements so that it may be further subtilized, and that it may be better purified by separating itself from its feces, and that afterwards it is united more strongly. For whatever has been born or not, it must have been decayed before, like the grain of wheat that must be thrown into the earth so that it rots before it takes any other form. It is the established order for the in nature. It is this fire of manure that is so necessary production of the fruits of the earth. It is these axles of espagnate that turn the wheel of nature, this fire that must be introduced into the womb, and that makes all the wonders that we notice in our work, of which I have spoken. It is this first agent of Flamel, that which Pontanus describes admirably by saying that it is aqueous, aerial, igneous, and terrestrial, and which he compares to the 3 humours of our body, by saying that it is phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic. Trevisan says much the same thing by saying that it is vaporous, circulating, digesting, non-burning. All of this marks the fire of putrefaction, participating in the 4 qualities, cold, hot, dry, and humid. He also says that it participates in sulphur and that it is argent 5. It is by means of this fire, which does not come from the matter, but which is taken from elsewhere, and which will complete the whole work without the apposition of the artist's hands, because it putrefies, corrupts, engenders, and perfects that which is impure and imperfect. It brings out the principal colours of the work, which are black, white, and red. It changes, cooks, and digests the crude matter by the means of which one multiplies the stone. It is the key of the philosophers which they have never taught. This work is thus accomplished in a short time by means of this fire and without the help of the artist, because it putrefies, corrupts, regenerates, and perfects itself, as already explained above. Moreover, it makes the 3 colours appear, which are black, white, and red. And by means of our fire, the medicine is cooked, digested, changed, and multiplied by adding the crude matter, both in quantity and quality. It is the first and the proper agent. This fire is found in manure. This is why it gives fecundity to the earth by corrupting and putrefying the seeds. That is why it is called fire of manure. Flamel makes us a fairly accurate picture of it in the figures of Abraham the Jew, as depicted in the Chemical Library. He depicts for us an old hollow oak from which a fountain emerges, and from the same water a gardener waters the plants and flowers of a garden. The old oak, which is hollow, signifies the barrel which is made of oak. The water stored within it must be corrupted in this barrel in order to water the plants, for this water is much better than the crude water. Philosophers have many other fires, which I will explain in their context and in their place. The secret of this operation is to know the time of this putrefaction in advance, for care must be taken that it does not pass into leprous and vermicular putrefaction, for all your work would be destroyed. If the matter is not sufficiently putrefied and mortified, you will not be able to extract our elements and principles. And to help you in this difficulty, I will give you signs by which to recognize it. Some philosophers have also pointed this out. Morienus said, "It is necessary to notice some acidity, and that it has some odour of the sepulchre." Philalethes says that it must appear like the eyes of fish, that is to say, like small bubbles on the surface, and it appears to foam, because it is a sign that the matter ferments and boils. This fermentation is very long, and it is necessary to have great patience, because it is done by our secret fire, which is the only agent, as the author of the War of the Knights says, which can open, sublimate, and putrefy, and this fire, he adds, is a heavenly water that operates the solution, the animation, and the purification of the stone. But this is the place to reveal one of the great mysteries of this art, which philosophers have hidden. Without this vessel you cannot make this putrefaction and purification of our elements, just as wine cannot be made without fermenting it in the barrel. Deg now, as the barrel is made of oak, so the vessel must be of old oak wood, rounded inside like a half-globe, whose edges are very stout and square, failing which, a keg and another to cover it. Almost all philosophers have spoken of this vessel, which is absolutely necessary for this operation. Trevisan says that near the fountain, which must be the king's bath, it was at the foot of an oak tree. Philalethes describes it by the fable of the serpent Python, which Cadmus pierced also against a hollow oak. Flamel relates the same fable on this subject, and says that we must be aware of this word oak. Our oak, says Abraham the Jew, and who shows the thing more precisely by the figure reported by Flamel in the Chemical Library. You see there an old oak from which flows a water, which the gardener uses to water the plants of a flower bed, which emerges from the trunk of an old oak tree. There are 2 flowers and roses above, one white and the other red, which signify that it is our water that contains the white and the red, the sun and the moon. This also indicates that it is of these 2 substances that we make our wine, indicated by the barrel. There is a figure in the book of the 12 keys which represents this same operation and the vessel in which it is made. It is a barrel from which a great cloud of smoke emanates, which marks the fermentation and the boiling of this water, and this smoke ends at a window where we see the sky, in which the sun and the moon are depicted, which mark the origin of this water and the virtues it contains. It is our mercurial vinegar, which descends from heaven to earth and ascends from earth to heaven, of the extraction of the 2 luminaries, gold and mercury. This vinegar must first be distilled, otherwise it is not of much use, so to speak. Put it in a glass alembic fitted with its capital and its recipient, to still at first with a slow fire, and when nothing more will distill, put the water which will have distilled in the recipient back on the feces. Then restart the distillation. If the same fire no longer distills anything, proporcrease the fire a little, and continue at the same degree until the water no longer rises to the top of the alembic. Then put the distillate back into the alembic, and start the distillation again, and do the same as above, increasing the fire shinily so that the water rises. Do the first one in the BM, the second in the ashes, and the third in the sandbath, and when nothing more rises by the sandbath, let the vessel cool down, and having poured the water which is found in the cucurbit by inclination, take out the feces which are at the bottom, and calcine them to whiteness. Then set your water apart, and distill it with a small retort. This water is the white and lunar spirit, with which one draws the red spirit from the white earth, for then it will be dyed red in digestion, or citrine yellow by BM, because this white earth contains the red spirit and the salt. When it has obtained this colour, pour out the water by inclination, which you then set apart. Add new distilled water. After calcining the earth and reverberating it, put the distilled vinegar back on the matter that is in the retort until it no longer tinges. Then, pushed through the retort, it will first pass as a white spirit, then as a red spirit, which will be dyed by repeated cohobation with the aforesaid distilled vinegar. And when the vinegar no longer absorbs any more dye, after having been submitted to the sandbath, this operation will give you the red mercury and the citrine mercury. Take what remains at the bottom of the retort, then 49 it in the little reverberation furnace for 24 hours, and put when it is well reverberated and white and perfectly crushed. Put this matter in a small glass vessel and pour over it 4 fingers of distilled vinegar. Then, having stopped the vessel, put it to the BM for 8 days, at the end of which pour the vinegar by inclination, being careful not to disturb the bottom. Then put on new vinegar and proceed as the first time, and pour out the vinegar by inclination. Afterwards, discard the feces as useless. Then evaporate the said vinegars on a slow fire, and you will find at the bottom of the vessel a salt which has admirable virtues, and if you want to make it even more perfect, repeat the same operation as above, and your salt will be as white as crystal. This salt is the body of the moon, which serves for the white work and the composition of the mercury of the philosophers, as stated in Chapter 2. Pour this precious salt into a small matrix. It will dissolve when you pour the white spirit distilled in the retort on it and put it in the BM for 8 days. Then, pouring everything by inclination and rejecting the feces, you will have the of the moon and the white spirit. This is Diana, the Mercury, living moon, the female who is still a virgin, having not yet suffered the embraces of the male. Join together the white Mercury and the red Mercury, 2 parts of the white Mercury to 1 part of the red Mercury. This liquor, thus mixed, is called the first elixir, from which the luminaries are drawn, in the manner that follows. These are nothing but spirits, and those who follow the spirits are the bodies. The authors who have spoken of this operation are first of all Penotus, who speaks of it under the preparation of his Marcasite in a letter written in Latin, where he warns us not to understand what he says according to the letter, because beforehand, he says, it is necessary to meditate on what the philosophers say in their books, and not to take what they say according to the letter, but according to the meaning. That is why each person must commit and apply himself to discover what the philosophers mean to say. In order to interpret the meaning of their words, and not their words themselves, it is therefore necessary to study them well, to go deeply into them, and to meditate on them in a way that they can be understood. This is the only way of attaining to their sciences. You will find many of these operations in the works of Isaac Hollandus, if you know how to separate the false operations, which he mixes in with his extraction of honey and sugar and his little solar rose herb. If you know, like the bee, how to take the true honey and the true dew, then you know what he means by these words, honey, solar herb, and sugar, which is no small difficulty. And you can, therefore, distinguish the true operations from the false, with all the useless vessels that the philosophers say they use to hide their operations from the false philosophers and the vulgar chymists. For the authors who speak the most clearly are the ones we must be most careful about following to the letter. Nevertheless, of all the philosophers, he is the one who enters most into the practice of the operations. Arnaldus de Villanova is another philosopher who writes in this genre. He seems to speak of the operations according to the letter. Geber, Raymond Lull, and Ripley have almost followed the same method. We must therefore read the philosophers with a grain of salt. Basil Valentine is even more verbose in his 12 keys, which causes much trouble in the beginning. It is preferable to focus on the reading of those who continue to write about the whole work with only a few words, and to endeavour to know the principles of this. Great work before putting the hand to the work, in order to have distinct rules for the principles, to know and distinguish whether what the philosophers say is true or false. It is in order to help you in this practice that I first gave you the principles that should guide you out of this labyrinth, and serve as a beacon to enlighten you, so that you cannot get lost in this black forest, but rather escape from this darkness. This is what I wanted to warn you about before proceeding to the other operations. Philalethes says that these operations are the work of Hercules, that it is necessary to attempt other ways, being much easier, because nature has a greater role here than art. Because, he says, this is what made the famous author of the Hermetic Secret say that this first work is a work of Hercules, because in our principles there is much heterogeneous superfluity, i.e., different natures which can never be made must be pure enough to serve our work, and which absolutely removed before we can draw the menstrual blood from our prostitute, that is to say, from our mercury. It is not that a woman cannot do this work, provided that she makes it her principal work, but once we have the mercury of the philosophers fully prepared, then we have found repose. One can, he says, find our matter in another place, and our philosophical gold in an impure and imperfect matter in a week. This is our way, which is but easy, rare, God having reserved it for the poor and for the good people who are held in contempt. This is what we describe. The other more difficult path is the mineral. Each of these two ways are true, because there is only one way of acting in the end, no matter how different they are at the beginning, because our sun is not vulgar gold, and nevertheless it is in vulgar gold. But this way of searching for it is the longest, and so with that, it will not be as powerful nor as excellent as that which nature has left us and put in our hands. And yet, turning the wheel for a third time, will you find the same in both. But this, our work, is finished in 7 months, and it is the easiest. The other takes a year and a half, and it is called the mineral stone. Know, therefore, that this singular difficulty can only be found by reading the books of the most sincere philosophers, that all of them, such as they are, make a substitution in one regimen, and when they speak of a work, they mix the regimen of one with the practice of the other, of the extraction of the bodies of the two luminaries, sun and moon. There is nothing so hidden by the philosophers as this operation, which is followed by several others, and of which they have given very few words, although the perfection of our Mercury depends on it. The most sincere, such as Artephius, Trevisan, and Flamel, have passed over those operations which they have assumed, and those who have spoken of them in silence. They have done it with such confusion that without an inspiration from heaven, or without the help of a friend, it is impossible to get out of this labyrinth. These operations consist of the separation and purification of our Mercury, which is done by a perfect dissolution and glorification and purification of the body from which it originates, and by the union of the soul with the body of the pure sun, i.e., of the moon with the body of the sun, whose spirit is the only bond that performs this conjunction. This is the end and goal of these operations, which terminate in the generation of a new substance, more noble than the first, which gives rise to the Mercury of the philosophers. The whole secret of these operations consists in separating the body of the moon from that of the sun, enclosed in the red dye, which we have called red spirit in the preceding chapter, where we have taught you the means to extract it. Put this red spirit, or solar tincture, in a flat vessel whose bottom is wide enough that you can cover with it a kind of glass hood that closes the vessel perfectly. Having sealed the joints with a suitable lute for this vessel, you will add twice as much of the white spirit as you originally put on the BM for 8 days, as advised by Arnaldus de Villanova in his Rosary. For in this distillation, he says, it is only the parts of the water which penetrate and subtilize, and this is achieved almost without any external heat, and it is the most subtle parts of the matter that are reduced in nature, like simple water in the vessel. And with regard to the earth, which contains fire and air, as they are attached to coarser parts, it is necessary to use an ash bath. Refer to the Rosary, chapter 7. This distillation is done without an alembic, and in the same vessel the separation is made of the earth and the water, without the artist putting his hands on it. When 8 days have passed, you will see that the red will begin to darken. Change the fire and put it on an ash bath without letting your matter cool down. Open your vessel from time to time, and when you see a black ash, like a subtle earth, floating on the surface of the water, collect it in the same way as cream is collected from milk. This is the comparison given by Philalethes, when says that our sun coagulates in the manner of flowers, or cream of milk, and this sulphur must float above the waters in the manner of an earth or subtle ash. This subtle earth is the fixed sulphur, and the dead body which must be animated by giving to it its soul, which is shut up in its sepulchre, meaning its darkness. Aristeas, a very learned philosopher, describes this operation admirably in his third enigma in these terms. It is a root that is conserved with its green juice, filled with strength and its own moisture, and suitable to the solar nature. After that, it is put into the vessel where it is purified until its spirit or saline root appears via the liquid tincturing lotion that must be completely taken with the body, leaving the feces and the coarse parts that remain by the red tincture that it draws from this. He teaches us about the first tincture that still needs to be rectified and clarified, and the latter, which is our spirit. It is necessary to separate the feces, and this separation is done by exposing this tincture to the sun or to a fire similar to that of the sun. Then he adds that it is enclosed in this body and black earth, a fusible and pure substance that can only be extracted with much labour and industry. Arnoldus de Villanova, in chapter 4, also describes this operation in these terms. It is for this reason that this black earth is the body of the matter being dissolved. Take it all and put it into digestion in a temperate heat, so that it putrefies and digests more easily during a philosophical month, that is, to say 30 days. And cook it at a gentle fire, so that everything evaporates and is subtilized, he adds, because the heat is acting on the first humidity of blackness, this blackness being the head of the raven. But the principle of our work is to dissolve our stone in mercurial water. Now you cannot have that mercurial water which we call the luminary, other than by the separation of this black earth. It is then that this black earth is the body of the sun, and the water is the body of the moon. It is necessary to set aside this water and this black earth, which must be joined afterwards, as we will teach in the following chapter, says the Hermetic Triumph, page 110. You may have noticed that in the main operations of the art, it is always two things that produce one. Of these two things, one takes the place of the male, and the other of the female. One is the body, the other is the spirit, or the male and his female. The body and the spirit are nothing but the body and the blood, and these two things are of the same nature and kind. So the solution of the body in its own blood is the same as the solution of the male by the female, as we will say hereafter. These words are taken from the author of the War of the Knights. That is what I wanted to remark to you, because they are precisely suited to these operations. You must still know, as the Hermetic Triumph says, page 109, that the general intention of our art is to purify exactly and to subtilize a matter from its own filth and coarseness, and that in order to attain to this end several operations are required which are properly one, and the same operation diversely continued. In this operation it is not properly a separation, but rather a conversion, as the Hermetic Triumph says. This operation is still precisely marked in the little treatise of Aristotle, which is found in the Artis Aurifera in these terms, which he says he took from Avicenna. When you see the blackness appear on the surface of the water, collect it adroitly, and be persuaded that your stone is partially dissolved. Distill the whole through some linen, recook what is left, and repeat until everything becomes black in the fire of the first degree, warm and humid, and if you make a stronger fire, the blackness will turn into redness, which proves that it will be burnt. That is why, if you direct your fire according to art, you will find the head of the raven, which is the darkness. It is necessary to take care that as this black ash is made, it is separated. It is necessary to take care to set it apart. Then put your vessel back to the BM and continue thus until the red gives no more. The sign that you will have is that the water will become white. After drying this black earth, set it apart by a slow fire, put it in a cucurbite or a mattress, and reserve these white water or the lunaria as described above, and put two substances to the fire of putrefaction for a philosophical month. As said, Avicenna reports in the little treatise of Aristotle, take, he says, what is dissolved, put it in a cucurbite, and pour over it the black. Powder which you have gathered before, shut it up in the alembic, which you will put on a slow fire for a philosophical month, so that it will be more corrupted and putrefied. Of the conversion of the elements, the conjunction of the two luminaries, the moon and the sun. The time of this putrefaction being completed, you will add its head, and the receiver to the cucurbite you will distill by a very slow fire. For fear of burning the tinctures, which would change the black body into a red, that would be the sign that it would be burnt. This must be carefully avoided, as Aristotle warns us in his little treatise on the stone of the philosophers. Close, said he, your vessel for fear that what you have put into it will not vent out for 8 philosophical months, and distill it gently, and take good care that you do not burn the tincture by too great a fire. Rhazes also says that the secret of this operation is to prepare subtly, and that, if the tincture is burned, the artist must expect no good effect. Arnaldus de Villanova, chapter 8, says the same thing, and in the event that this happens, he puts the whole back to digestion and restarts the operations. He advises to use for this the fire of manure, that is to say, of a vaporous and humid fire. To do this operation properly, which consists in whitening this raven, which is also called ablution and inhumation, all the water must be distilled in the said BM, and you will find a black earth at the bottom of the cucurbite, and after having distilled to the point of dryness, water it gently and imbibe it with its distilled water, then dry it, then let it drink again from the same water a little each time. For if you did otherwise and put too much water, you would extinguish the fire of the said earth, or you would dissolve it too quickly, make it drink as much water as it can drink. But by the repeated waterings and distillations, the earth will be whitened. Avicenna says that in the 7th distillation it will be white and clear as crystal, by which he means the second operation which follows it. For in this one it is only white. So one draws the sal ammoniac or the nitre salt of the cosmopolitan with the lunar spirit to extract the mercury of the philosophers, as we shall hereafter say, conflating the two operations together. So continue the fire gently and put on a receiver to receive the water that comes out, because that which is distilled first is the phlegmatic water that is never pure. Then the fire comes next with the air that is mixed with it, keeping them together until you divide it, and what remains at the bottom is the burnt and dried earth. Thus you have the 4 elements separated into parts, but which are not yet purified. The first element that comes out is the cold, moist, pure water of its nature, which must be distilled 7 times, and it will be very beautiful and clear and white as crystal. There are still other philosophers who mingle these 2 operations together. Arnaldus de Villanova similarly confounds these 2 operations, of the 2 making only one, when he describes it in these terms, that all the earths and feces which come from the separations of the elements and principles must be joined to the black earth. He adds more water that has been distilled 7 times. It must be divided also into 7, and put one after the other on the earth, because it is the mercury of the philosophers. Thus, if we do not know the principles of our science, it is easy to deceive ourselves by reading the books of these philosophers, because they often join different operations together, and often mingle false ones to hide their sciences from the ignorant. The author of The War of the Knights marks, for us very learnedly and in a palpable manner, in the book of the Hermetic Triumph, page 132, with these words: "After the wise man has brought out a spring of living water from the stone, he pressed out the juice from the vine of the philosophers and made their wine. This is the liquor that he has put in the hollow of the oak from which he has drawn the wine. He must observe that in this homogeneous substance, which appears in the form of water, that is, when it is separated from the black, it contains, albeit in potency, 3 different substances and 3 natural principles of all bodies, salt, sulphur, and mercury, which contains spirit, soul, and body. That is why it is said that our stone has spirit, body, and soul, and though they appear pure and perfectly united together, it is far from being so. For when by distillation we draw the water which is mixed with the soul and the spirit, the body remains at the bottom of the vessel like a dead and feculent black earth, but, as Pontanus says, everything superfluous, foul, and feculent remains at the bottom. Finally, all the substance of the compound is perfected by the action of our fire. Then he adds that the children of science must not ignore that the fire and sulphur are hidden in the centre of the earth, or that this black earth must be washed with its spirit, that is to say, more precisely, with the lunar body, which is the white spirit with its whitening, to extract from. It, as the same author adds, the balm, the fixed salt, which is the blood of our stone, from which is formed, as we teach below, the mercury of the philosophers, and the dissolvent of the perfect bodies of the sun and the moon, as much for the white as for the red. This is confirmed by Arnaldus de Villanova in chapter 8. Of this water, which has been distilled 7 times, you will put one of the 7 parts on this precious earth or fixed salt, because it is the mercury of the philosophers, and that which performs the marriage. And it is this water which washes the laton, and the spirit that will have dissolved the body of the sun will serve only for the red, taking good care not to conflate them together. This is what Arnaldus de Villanova makes us understand in the same cited place. Act in the same manner with the red water as you did with the white water, because it is the same method that must be observed, and it has the same effect, except that this white water serves to make the white, and the red to make the red. Do not mix these 2 waters together, because you will lose your work. This is how you will be sure, by observing what we have just said. With these operations you have joined the moon to the body of the sun, which are but one body. The philosophers call this earth by many names, such as arsenic, their poison or their foliated earth, because it is leafy. From this earth the fixed salt, the sal ammoniac, and the sublimed mercury are extracted in order to make the mercury of the philosophers. We will teach you how to do this in the next chapter, in which consists the great secret of this art, of the mercury of the philosophers. This is the place to speak of that admirable water of which the philosophers tell so many virtues, and which they call their mercury par excellence, the composition of which they have, hidden by an infinity of terms, only known to the true philosophers, by allegories, similitudes, and by 1,000 borrowed names, and under terms not only equivocal, but even opposed. That appears to be a surprising annoyance to those who are not initiated into our philosophical mysteries. What obliges them to do so is, that when one has once succeeded in making this water, the labour is much less than the preceding operations. It, nevertheless, still has some impurities which must be separated, and must still pass through the degrees before it comes to its perfection, to make it into the perfect elixir. This water is the key and the masterpiece of the Hermetic philosophy, since by it begins, perfects itself, and finally completes their great work, which they call their stone, and the great Hermes speaks of its properties and virtues only with exclamation, which he describes without saying a word about how it is made and of what it is drawn from. O blessed aqueous form by which it dissolves all the elements. He says again, the elements of the stone can only be dissolved by this all-divine water by a proportionate digestion and putrefaction. Artephius, Flamel, Trevisan, and there is hardly one who has not presumed its preparation, though it is the most important one. For it is that which makes the sublimation of the stone and the conversion of the principles and elements, as is noted by the author of the War of the Knights, which makes the water from the earth, the air from the water, and the fire from the air, by which way our mercury can be made and prepared. Of this pray the Hermetic Triumph, page 130, says that it is in this water that the sacred fire of the sages is contained, which is consequently the only instrument that can carry out this sublimation. I have described to you this fire, and I have revealed to you that powerful agent that works all the marvels that God will in art. If why do not understand, you lighten you. For the knowledge of this secret, says the author of the Hermetic Triumph, is rather a gift from heaven than a light acquired by reasoning. It is by means of this fire which is contained in this water and in our mercury, says the author of the Hermetic Triumph, that it dissolves the stone naturally and without violence, and causes it to resolve into water in the great sea of the sages by the dissolution, which is made from rays of the sun and the moon, which is the vine of their rectified water of life and their sharpest vinegar. The sages, It is therefore the most important of all the operations of our practice. And as it is the maze in which the disciple of our art inevitably remains if they cannot find the desired exit. That is why I will extend a little more than the philosophers have done, who speak so confusedly of this water that it is not possible to understand it without an inspiration from heaven. You see by this that there is nothing so rare and so precious as that liquor which they have hidden under 1,000 different names. Some call it their water of life, eau de vie, the water of Diana, the great lunaria, the water of argent vive, our mercury, our incombustible oil which congeals like ice in the cold and melts like butter in the heat. Hermes calls it the foliated earth, or the earth of leaves, for the matter from which it is drawn is quite foliated, in a word, the every clear fountain mentioned by Count Trevisan and the Hermetic Triumph, page 144, is. Ultimately, the great alkahest which radically dissolves the perfect metals, it is the true permanent water, which, after having dissolved them, is inseparonited to them, increasing the weight and tincture. You, I assure you, that who are the true children of science will receive a great satisfaction from the clarification of these hidden mysteries which concern the separation and purification of the principles. Of our mercury, which I touched upon in the previous chapter, the preparation of the coarsest, and of the matter, from what and where it takes its origins. In this chapter, the elements are more spiritual and freed from matter. I will therefore follow by order all that pertains to the purification of this divine water, and I follow in order all that depends on it to its full perfection. And I will add to it all that the most famous authors have said more precisely and very confusedly. Now, as the intention of the sages is to give gold more perfection than it has received by nature, and to give it the virtue of multiplying to make it their universal medicine on this principle, it is evident that common gold is not their gold, since it is finite, and it cannot acquire greater perfection. This is what the Hermetic Triumph says in the dialogue of the stone with vulgar gold. Gold, he says, is a perfect metal which, because of its perfection, cannot be pushed to a more perfect degree. Thus, whatever may be done with gold, whether one knows how to extract its colour and its tincture, the artist will never make more gold and never tinge a greater quantity of metal. Raymond Lull says, "What must be made better must not be perfect, because in that which is perfect there is nothing to change, and that one would instead destroy its nature. There is," says Geber, "in the depths of our mercury, a sulphur which cooks and digests it. It is this sulphur which is their living gold, which even gives life to common gold, which makes it vegetate, that is grow, 58, and multiply by means of our water, and which forms and accomplishes our great work, which they commonly call the philosopher's stone." It should be noted in passing that the term stone is tak en in several different senses. In the work, this is what makes Geber say that there are 3 stones which are the 3 medicines corresponding to the 3 degrees of perfection in the work. The stone of the first order is the matter of the philosophers perfectly purified and reduced to pure mercurial substance. The stone of the second order is the same matter cooked, digested, and fixed into incombustible sulphur. The stone of the third order is the same fermented matter, multiplied and pushed to the last perfection of the fixed, permanent, and tinging tincture. To know what the philosophers mean by their gold, you must know that there are 3 kinds of gold. The first is an astral gold, which is produced by the light and rays of the sun, whose body is the centre. It is an igneous substance and a continual emanation of the solar corpuscles which fill the whole universe and blend with all mixts. The second is an elementary gold, and the purest part of the fixed sulphur contained in the depths of the elements, and of which each mix contains a grain of that precious gold which is multiplied by this astral gold, of which it is the magnet, and which forms the gold of the philosophers. When this gold has been perfectly calcined and exalted, that is to say, reduced to a white salt like snow, then it has a great sympathy with this astral gold, from which it is visibly the magnet. The third is the metallic and vulgar gold, which is a body without soul, which can only be vivified by our living gold or by means of our magistry. In the same way, to know what the philosophers mean by their mercury, you must know that there are three species. The first is a spiritual substance, aerial, participating a little in sulphur. It is of the nature of the air, which is its vehicle. That is why it leaves at the slightest heat. It communicates life and the generative force to the sublunary things. It carries a fermentative fire into the seeds. There is a philosopher who calls it lunatic Vulcan. By the second they mean a homogeneous substance formed by the union of two bodies which destroy each other, acting on one another as the male and the female, or as body and spirit, which results in a substance which has all the necessary dispositions to be procreated by art and nature, to develop from perfection to perfection until the sovereign degree. The third species is the metallic and common mercury, which may become the mercury of the philosophers when it is joined to the one and only mercury of metals in the form of raw and not yet mature sperm. For it contains within it the virtue of tinging and perfecting metals, because it was formerly gold and silver in potential, as the Cosmopolitan says. It is called hermaphrodite, because it contains its male and its female in its own belly, and having been digested into a pure and fixed whiteness, it becomes silver, and then, having been pushed to redness, it becomes gold. Of the separation and purification of the principles of our mercury in general, I do not doubt that the true children of science receive a great satisfaction from the clarification of these hidden mysteries. This separation and purification of the principles which compose our mercury consists, in general, in a perfect dissolution and sublimation of the body of the moon from which it is born, and by the intimate union of the soul with its body, whose spirit is the unique bond which makes this union and conjunction, from which a substance infinitely more noble than the first results. I have already taught you the principal operations of our divine art. You have seen that it is always two things that produce one, that of these two things one takes the place of the male and the other of the female. One is the body and the other is the spirit, that the male and the female are nothing but the body and the spirit, and, according to the expression of particular philosophers, the body is the blood or the menstruum. You have also seen that these two things are of the same nature and drawn from the same root, so that the solution of the body in its own proper blood is the solution of the body, which is the white body, or the moon which philosophers call white gold. This is the solution of the male by the female, for the white body contains the red, or the body its female red spirit. But this solution would not succeed as well, as the author of the Hermetic Triumph excellently indicates, without the conjunction of the female. It is, he says, in their reciprocal embracements that they merge and change into one another. In vain would you have, he said, opened and sublimed the body of the stone, that is to say, the white earth, which is the earth from which you have drawn. This precious salt, if you did not make him marry the woman whom nature has destined for him, she is that spirit from which the body or salt derives its first origin. This precious salt dissolves like ice at the slightest heat from the fire. Now this precious salt, which he calls body, is made by the continual effusion of its own blood, which is its natural menstruum, with which it unites so closely and intimately that they are but one and the same substance. It is that substance which is the proximate matter from which the mercury of the philosophers is formed, as we shall say in the next chapter. The whole secret, therefore, consists, after having washed this dead and black earth and cutting off the head of the raven, as we have taught, this earth must not be thrown away, for fire and sulphur are hidden in this earth, which must be washed, says the author of the Hermetic Triumph, with its spirit to extract a balm, the fixed salt which is the blood of our stone. This operation is accomplished only after a suitable digestion and by a slow distillation. This is confirmed by Hermes, It is necessary that by means of the aqueous soul we have the sulphurous form, which is done by our vinegar, by mixing it with this said vinegar, because it dissolves in the component, and it becomes very clear and very sovereign. The Cosmopolitan has taught the means in a few words, and he says, after having purged your elements, make it so that fire and water become friends, which you will do thus, by pouring on the earth the spirit that has been drawn from it. And the author of the Hermetic Triumph adds, page 134, that I will do it by watering the earth with its water, for it is necessary that the body be dissolved by water, and the earth be penetrated by its humidity to generate our sun from the sun, which is our mercury. This mercury is formed from the union of these two substances, one of which is the spirit, and the salt is the body. It is the volatile and the fixed which join together, which are nevertheless of the same nature and embrace as male and female, and which rise together imperceptibly, appearing at the top of the vessel in the manner of a crystalline salt that melts and is reduced into water by itself, and for that reason is also different from the first liquid form. As the Hermetic Triumph remarks, page 135, the spirit of wine, precisely rectified and sharpened by its salt, is different from the wine from which it has been derived. Hermes says that it is this water that we need more in our work, which comes out of this stone. The philosophers hide these operations by mixing it with the preceding ones. That is why the wise artist must be on guard, and I would have been deceived myself had I not been very careful. The author of the Hermetic Triumph, who is the clearest on these operations, joins that of which we have just spoken with, that in which the white spirit and the red spirit are drawn. The Triumph still describes this operation in these terms. If you do not whiten these feculent and black feces, you will not separate the white sulphur, the sal ammoniac of the sages, which is their chaste Diana, who bathes herself in the bath. All this mystery is but the extraction of the fixed salt in which all the force of our mercury consists. The water, which is elevated by distillation, carries with it a portion of this igneous salt, so that the infusion of the water on the body, repeated several times, impregnates, fattens, and fertilizes our mercury, and makes it proper to be fixed, i.e., that it produces the mercury and the water that compose this dry water. It is from this salt that the mercury of the philosophers is formed when it is joined with the dry water and radical humidity of the bodies of the sun and the moon. It is the nitre salt of the Cosmopolitan which is reduced to the water which composes this admirable nitre salt, which, being joined to the humid radical, forms our mercury, which is called the water of Nitra, aqua salis nitri de terra nostra, in qua est unda viva, as the philosophers teach, especially in the next chapter. 62. Of the composition of the great solvent and the mercury of the philosophers. Since I speak only to you, true disciples of Hermes, I wish to reveal to you a secret which you will not find entirely in the books of the philosophers. Some are content to say that of their liquors are made of 2 mercuries, as the Hermetic Triumph remarks on page 141, the one white and the other red. Flamel in particular notes the usage, saying that one must use the citrine mercury for the ablutions to the red. Consequently, for the white mercury, as other philosophers say, the white mercury is the bath of the moon, and the red mercury the bath of the sun. The white mercury is the lunaria, and the red mercury is the sharpest vinegar, as the Hermetic Triumph says. This operation is precisely marked by the author of the Hermetic Triumph. Page 14.63 nourish, he says, these 2 mercuries with a flesh of their species, the blood of the slaughtered innocents, that is to say, the spirits of the bodies are the bath where the gold and the moon go to bathe. The Cosmopolitan says the same thing. In other words, our old man will devour gold and silver, and both will be consumed after their deaths. Plus the old man, as the Hermetic Triumph explains, is our mercury, since it is the first matter of metals, which is the dry water of Geba, and the unctuous humidity, which is the proximate matter of our stone, which contains the sulphur and the mercury of the sages, both the white sulphur, which is extracted from the body of the moon, and the sulphur which contains the red body, which contains all that is necessary to the work, and which is called animated mercury and double mercury. And, by others, rebis, which never loses its virtue, being enclosed in a bottle of glass, well sealed, as the Hermetic Triumph says on page 144. By this you see the merit of that precious liquor, to which the philosophers give 1,000 different names. It is the water of life of the sages, the water of Diana, the lunar, great Ia. It is our mercury, our incombustible oil which congeals in the cold and liquefies in the heat. Hermes calls it the earth of the leaves. It is the fountain of Count Trevisan. It is the great alkahest, says the Triumph, which radically dissolves the metals. It is the true permanent water which dissolves the perfect bodies and unites inseparably with them, increasing the weight and tincture. Philalethes describes this operation a little differently. Our animated mercury, he says, although purified, is not yet coagulated, but is still volatile. It is not yet perfect until it leaves no feces or sediment in the vessel, for at that time the philosophic salt is called an undigested sun, which is not yet mature. It is their living moon, it is the true and first being of. Gold, being still volatile, it is the field in which the sun is sown. That is why the first philosophers, he says, by this means, made the fixed volatile, the hard soft, the coagulated dissolved. That is why they put the two things together, enclosed them in a glass vessel, and put them on the fire. And in another place, he says again, you must know that our work demands a true change of nature, which cannot be done if the last union of two natures, that is to say, of the fix, and the volatile is not done, and can only end in the form of water, because there is no union of the bodies, but it is only a grinding, because only the spirits can unite well together. This is why, for the union of our mercuries, a metallic homogeneous water is required, for which the way is prepared by calcination, which is a prerequisite, and which is previously made by a drying out, which is properly a dissolution or reduction into atoms of the water with the earth, through the sieve of nature, that is to say, and the atoms of water are more loosened and more subtilized than water requires, and which is necessary, so that the earth receives the fermentative from the water. The Triumph says it even more positively. Reduce, says he, the whole compound to water, and make a perfect union of the volatile and the fixed. The water, which rises by distillation, carries with it a part of this igneous salt, so that the effusion of the water on the body, repeated several times, permeates, fattens and fertilizes our mercury, and makes it proper to be fixed, which is the purpose and the end of the second work. That which must be done after the sun has been dissolved by the mercury. 7. This operation, although already quite perfect, has not yet acquired its last and perfect depuration. That is why you put it in an adequate mattress, so that 3/4 of it is empty, and the neck must be at least 8 inches high. This done, plug the orifice of the mattress, and put it in ashes which surpass the matter by at least a finger. In this state, circulate your matters for a philosophical month, so that they will unite well together, and in the conjunction of these two substances there will be a fight, and you will see, in this vessel ascending and descending fumes, clouds and mists which proceed from the sulphur and foam of these two dragons, who fight and devour each other, until these two become one. Then calmness and serenity appears in the vessel, and the sea of the philosophers is completely tranquil, due to the cessation of the winds and storms which the fury of our two fighters had excited there. After that the sea has killed the serpent python that wanted to devour it. Hermes marks this operation in these terms. When I see the fullness of the water harden, and I see them noticeably begin to develop into this state, then I will rejoice. For then I will be sure to have found what I was looking for. While it is in this condition, draw the water from the mattress without disturbing the bottom, by inclination or by a strip of cloth, and put it in an adequate retort to rectify it for the last time on a sand fire by degrees. If, however, some feces remain in the retort after the distillation, it should be cohobated and distilled so often until nothing remains and everything passes into the receiver. Then you will have the perfect mercury of gold. Do the same with the perfect mercury of the moon. This is the end of the first work that many authors confuse with the second, mingling the operations which concern the first, or passing the first to make the second their first, which brings a great deal of embarrassment to novices and beginners. Finally, you have now been persuaded that from a vile subject we derive a precious liquor formed of a very subtle and volatile spirit and a very fixed oil, which being united to each other, embrace, never to leave each other. Thus the body, recovering its spirit, becomes immortal and glorious like the spirit. The sages have expressed all this to us by a serpent which bites its tail, which they adorn with the caduceus of Mercury. Flamel represents for us the same thing in his hieroglyphic figures by two dragons that devour themselves. They, i.e., the philosophers, want us to understand that their mercury is drawn from two substances of the same root, one of which is fixed and the other volatile, one corporeal and the other spiritual. Some philosophers call it the milk of the Virgin, and the child drawn from the belly of its mother, the spirit, which we draw is the milk or the son of this Virgin Mother, and the salt or fixed oil is the mother of this same son. Others say that the son must return to the womb of its mother, which marks for us the union and philosophical marriage of these two substances. That is why, after having drawn out the fixed salt of which we have spoken by means of the spirit, and having sufficiently purified it, we unite them together so that the conjunction of this body with this spirit is accomplished. This results in the universal solvent and the mercury of the philosophers. As to its origin, I have pointed out to you at the beginning of this work that it came from heaven and the influences of the stars, that it was a spirit which descended imperceptibly from heaven to earth. It was this universal spirit which regenerates in the virginal entrails of the earth that the philosophers bring to light, whose rebirth they bring about like the phoenix from the ashes. We have also said again that it derives all its strength and virtue from that invisible spirit which the air carries in its belly to enlarge the earth, which is the female that joins herself to the sulphur, which is the male. The concurrence of these two substances results in the prolific seed, of which the earth is the matrix, and says the magnet, as the great Hermes says in his emerald tablet, which was found in his sepulchre after the deluge in the valley of Hebron. The sun is its father, he and the moon the mother, and it is carried by the winds in the bosom of the earth, as in the maternal embrace of its wet nurse. This is to hide it from our eyes until the industry of the sage makes it appear, releasing it with the help of the fire which comes from the subject in which it is hidden, as we have taught. It is therefore this same spirit which descends from above the heavens into the centre of the earth, where it begins to coagulate itself by the virtue of its hermaphroditic salt, which is its magnet, which the philosophers call their steel, because it continually attracts this spirit and retains it by coagulating it. It is this salt, impregnated with the celestial virtue, which must be drawn with great industry, as Hermes says. You must subtly and skilfully separate the earth from the secret fire, gently and with great spirit, separating it from its density, but be careful not to smother the fire of this earth by the waters of the flood. It is this king who descends from heaven. It is the soul which must be restored to its body that must resurrect him. These are his words. It is the divine water. It is the king descended from heaven who recalls the soul to its body and who again restores life to that which was dead. By this you see that this invisible spiritual quintessence is now made visible and corporeal. It is this son of the lily who is reborn from his mother's womb by distillation. It is this son, too, whom the industrious artist knows how to draw from his mother's womb, and who afterwards renders his mother fertile, and by this means engenders children infinitely. This is why the sages make Mercury say, "The mother who has engendered me has been engendered by me," and by this spiritual son she is also ceaselessly in a state of regenerating this son and reproducing him. You therefore have all the elements you need, fixed and in their own proper repose, to suffer the great digestion. Lacking this, many who have not attained this peace have wanted to begin a long digestion. The elements have divided and rarefied, their vessels have shattered, and they have lost all their work, even if they were working on the true matter. End of this work. Table of what is contained in this manuscript, which can serve as an abridged instruction. First chapter. The Holy Scripture likens the green coloration with gold. God has hidden from men the knowledge of the matter. The matter is unique in its principle, and nature works according to the same principles. The philosophers have made use of two different ways for the work. The first costs much and concerns art. The second concerns nature and costs little. These different ways differ. However, in the operations, etc., the philosophers say how alchemy came to be discovered, and still others who report by examples. The matter is generally enclosed within impure bodies. Second chapter. The matter in particular is an unctuous humidity. It hides in the centre of the elements. Fire does not have any power over it. This matter, though fixed, is volatilized by the elements. This matter encloses the fire of the sages, the time of collection, and from two sperms the matter of the Mercury is formed. The philosopher should imitate the nature that God has formed via the commerce of heaven and earth, imitating God in the creation of the O world. The philosopher draws from these two luminaries and from these elements all of the grossest parts. They make from them a compound or an elixir. God gives this science to whoever he pleases. It is not difficult for man to have the stone, but it is impossible for him to determine the matter. The matter is found everywhere. The expense of the work is modest, and the subject or matter is vile, though precious. Of the preparation of the elements and their separation in general, one doesn't change anything of the matter, and what appears to be impure, one changes into something purer, which is the fire of Pontanus. Take good notice of the residue, the type of separation of the substance in the first and second work. God created everything through number, weight, and measure. In the first work there is some separation, which is made by nature, and in the second it is the artist that separates. The substances unite together and form a water which is called argent vive. This water is very hidden, and its origin is from the air. One must take it in its hour of nativity. It is the water and the fire of the philosophers. It is in this water that they introduce their fire, which accords with the water and is the key to the work. Of the elements in particular and their preparations. The matter is found everywhere, but the philosophers have a particular subject in mind for use. One must take the matter in the moment and place of its birth by meditation. One must strip them, the elements, from the impure bodies. One must not be attached to the exterior of the principles, but their interior, and join the humid to the dry, fire to water, the warm to the cold. This work does not go beyond the capacities of man. Fifth chapter. Of the operations in general. There are 12 general operations, which are as many as the keys for unlocking the gates of the Hermetic Sanctum. The calcination of the work is not made through fire, the matter calcines itself. The rubification is included under the calcination. The trituration almost always precedes the calcination. The trituration of the matter is done by nature, who turns it into powder. This trituration is made when the earth starts to sublimate, which is the third preparation given to the subject. The dissolution is the reduction of a body into water by repeated washing. The whole matter is reduced to water. It is this fire that converts itself into water. It is in this operation that the stone dissolves itself. The hand of the artist is necessary in this dissolution. This operation is the key to the 7 gates. The first gives the entry to the second gives entry to the third, and so on until the 7th gate. This dissolution precedes the calcination, which is the most essential operation of the work. Sublimation is a purification of the subject which gets rid of the maternal impurities, or the body is sieved in this way. The water becomes more subtle and attracts to it the soul of the sun. One doesn't need so many vessels. The vessels are the elements. The distillation is often confused with the term sublimation. Take notice of the residue. The white spirit and the solar spirit of our body are the 2 first luminaries, the white mercury and the red mercury. Inhumation is an essential operation in the work. It is to make the earth spiritual, and from the spiritual make it corporeal, make the volatile fixed, and make the fixed more perfect. It is by this operation that one whitens the black and cuts the head off the raven. Look, by a continual fire a dew arises in the vessel, and a sort of fog settles incessantly night and day. The body communicates its fixity to the water, and the water communicates its volatility to the body. Washing is to make the black body white through repeated ablutions of its water, from which it has been drawn during the first and second work. The union of the 2 mercuries, white and red, which are the 2 substances for making the animated mercury and the citrine mercury of the first operation. This operation is again made for joining the moon to the body of the sun. It is the union of the male and female of the last work of the first part. Putrefaction is the generation of the lunar and solar substances from which the luminaries proceed. These are the little ravens that fly out of their nests, and which one must hinder from entering. It is the moment when one must carefully govern the fire, and not allow it to dry out the matter completely, and prevent the little ravens from returning to their nests, which are the little atoms. Coagulation, fixation, and nutrition concerns the second part of the work, which is multiplication. Second part of the operations particularly necessary for the practice. Be on guard how the philosophers write, because they confound their operations. That which must be at the beginning they put it at the end, and the end they put at the beginning. The stone is made in 2 different ways. The author of this book says that he intends to speak about the work of the ancients, and he defends the reading of certain manuscripts called processes. He warns that he does not describe the things point by point, that he does not use supposition or similitude, except for a few figurative expressions and some small veilsesi to develop. The author divides the work into 2 parts. The first concerns the composition of the stone and its perfection until the fermentation. The second part comprises all the operations which are necessary to do for the second and final perfection of the make note of this division. Stone. First chapter of the extraction of the work. After having drawn the matter from the mine, it is necessary to make a good supply of this water, because it contains much of the matter but little of the spirit. Notice the following articles. The repeated washings on the earth of this water, which changes into an unctuous milk that becomes the life of the matter of the stone. This water contains all the virtues of heaven and earth. It is the solvent of nature where the king and the queen bathe. The time to collect this water is during spring, in the 3 signs of Aries, Taurus, and Gemini. This water is a magnet that attracts all the influences of the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars to communicate them to the earth. We can only have this water by means of the earth. This water, after several and repeated washings on the earth, purifies it, and the earth gives all of its virtue to the water, not at the first washing, but after the 7th washing. Second chapter. The separation of the elements. Nature is stripped of all its impurities by the operation which is made during the separation of the elements, due to many superfluities and different natures which are in the principles, which is made through putrefaction. The grain of wheat cast unto the earth, and which rots, is reported, for example. It is the fire of manure that must be used for purifying, and which must be introduced into the matrix, which is aqueous, airy, igneous, and terrestrial. This fire participates in the four qualities, the cold and warm, the humid and the dry, and of sulphur also, and it is an argent vive. This fire, which does not come from the matter, completes the whole work, and perfects that which is impure and imperfect, and makes the three colours appear, the black, the white, and the red. This fire is found in the manure, which corrupts and putrefies the seeds, and gives fecundity to the earth. This fire is this water which comes out of a spring, which is in a hollow oak. This old hollow oak is the vessel which must be made of oak, in which one must corrupt the reserved water. There are other fires. The secret of the operation of this fire is to know the fixed time of this putrefaction. One cannot extract the elements or the principles without the matter having also been corrupted before. Putrefaction seems good when one finds some acidity in this watery fire and an odour of the sepulchre. Philolethes appear, small bubbles on the that there must says surface of the water that resemble fish eyes. This water is the secret fire and the agent that boils and ferments in the putrefaction, the secret and hidden mystery of the philosophers concerning the vessel. Take good notice of the articles before and after. The vessel which encloses the matter must be of wood from an oak. The old oak is taken here for the universal matter, from whose trunk two flowers emerge, one white and the other red, which are the two substances from which we draw our fire. Of the extraction of the two luminaries, gold and mercury, that is to say, the operation of these two substances that they call the mercurial vinegar, the manner of making the philosophers salt through the above operation, which is called the body of the moon, and which serves for the white work and the composition of the philosophers' mercury. Join the two mercuries, white and red, together, called elixir, spirit. Do not limit yourself to the words of the philosophers, but to the meaning of their words. The distinction which must be made and known of the true operations and false ones, and not to replace one matter with the other. The author advises to focus instead on the philosophers who have written little, and on certain rules of the principles. This work could be easily made by the hands of a woman. One can find the matter in an impure matter, and after a single week, which God has reserved for the poor. The two ways to the stone are true, however that of the poor is the most excellent. One way is made in 7 months and the other in 18 months. Be careful of the exchange that the philosophers make in the regimen of the two practices. 3rd chapter, on the extraction of the bodies of the two luminaries, sun and moon. Nothing is so hidden as the operation of the extraction of the two luminaries, sun and moon. It is impossible to guess it without divine inspiration or from a friend who tells you. These operations consist in dissolving and purifying the matter well through the union of the soul to the body, and in which the spirit is the only link which performs this conjunction. The separation of the body of the moon from that of the sun, which is enclosed in the red tincture, by adding 2 times as much of the white spirit. The separation of the earth that contains the fire and the air, which is made by removing the water from the earth. A black ash that is like a subtle earth swims on the surface of the water, which must be collected, which is like the. One must again rectify and clarify the first tincture, and the last one, which is the spirit, by separating the feces. When the black earth dissolves, it must be taken in order to further digest, putrefy, and cook it until it is subtilized. This earth or stone dissolves in the lunar mercurial water, which cannot be had unless one separates the black earth. In the principal operations, there are always 2 things that produce another, and of these 2 things one is the male and the other the female, the 3 principles. This operation is nothing but a separation. If one pushes the fire of the 1st degree until it is too hot, the black is converted to red and will be burnt. One must continue to set aside the black ash until there is no longer any redness, which arrives when the water becomes white. Take what is dissolved and pour over it, the black powder, in order to make it corrupt and putrefy. 4th chapter, of the conversion of the elements and the conjunction of the 2 luminaries, the moon and the sun, One must distill for 8 months on a slow heat the tinctures that will make the black body change into a burnt red. The manner of distilling this black earth with its water on a bain-marie for the whitening. One draws the salt of the earth, which will be white after the 7th distillation by the 2nd operation, with the lunar spirit for extracting the mercury of the philosophers. The first element that comes out is the pure water, cold and humid, which must be distilled 7 times. This water, which has been distilled 7 times, one must put one of the 7 on the fixed salt and observe the same method that one would use for the red water as the one you have made for the white water. 5th chapter, on the purification and separation of the principles of the mercury of the philosophers. This water is the key and the master of the Hermetic work, because it begins it and ends it. The philosophers have all hidden the preparation of this. The Hermetic triumph says that this water is the sacred fire of the sages and the only instrument for the sublimation. It has described all the marvels of the fire and of the water. If you do not understand these things, pray to God that he may enlighten you. It is this fire that is enclosed in this water, which is our mercury, and which dissolves the stone naturally and without violence. The different names that the philosophers have given to this so precious water, the virtue which one must give to gold in order to multiply it and make the universal medicine, the living sulphur of gold which gives life even to common gold, which makes it vegetate, that is, grow and multiply. The term stone is given in many different senses, as in 3 kinds of orders. 83rd. Remark to be made on the 3 orders of the stone, 3 sorts of gold, and 3 species of mercury. 6th chapter, on the separation and purification. The separation and purification principles of the plus philosophers, which consists of a perfect dissolution and sublimation, the solution of the white body or the moon called white gold. The solution cannot be made without the conjunction of the female with the male, which is the precious salt. This precious salt is called a body, and is made by a continual effusion of its own blood, which is a natural menstruum. One must not discard the dead earth, in which the fire and the sulphur are hidden, and which must be washed. Aqueous, to try to have, by means of the soul, the sulphurous form, which is done by our vinegar. To water the earth from its water, and be penetrated by its humidity to engender the mercury. The mercury is formed from the union of 2 substances, of which one is the spirit, and the salt is the body. A remark to make to not be mistaken by these operations, because the philosophers hide that the whole of this mystery is the extraction of the fixed salt, which produces the mercury and the water that composes this dry water. The composition of the great solvent and of the mercury of the philosophers is made from their liquors. They make 2 mercuries, the white for the bath of the moon, and the red for the bath of the sun. The Cosmopolitan said the same thing, in saying that our old man devours gold and silver, etc., many different names that the philosophers have given to this precious liquor. This precious liquor is the first being of gold, the fields in which the sun is sown, that the fixed was made volatile, what one must do after the sun has been dissolved by mercury. The combat of the 2 dragons that devour each other until these 2 become only one. Hermes said that one must see the mass of the water harden, coagulate to rejoice. Take care at the end of the first work to perfect the mercury. The mercury is drawn from 2 substances that come from one single root. One is fixed and the other volatile. Many names are given to this mercury. After having drawn these 2 substances by means of the fixed salt, it results in the universal solvent and the mercury of the philosophers. It derives all its strength and virtue from the invisible spirit in order to grow the earth, which is female, who is united to the male, which is sulphur. And from the struggle between these 2 substances comes the prolific seed. The emerald tablet of the great Hermes was found in his sepulchre in the valley of Hebron after the deluge. This same spirit descends from heaven into the centre of the earth, where it begins to coagulate by the virtue of its hermaphroditic salt, which is its magnet.